Hello and welcome to The View, a program which comes to you from the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN practitioners. I'm Virginie, and in this episode, our panel will be discussing the seismic impact of the conflict in Gaza on communities in Europe and beyond. And we will be looking at what this might mean for PCVE practitioners. To do this, we have assembled a stellar panel of experts. I'm joined by Virginie, André, Senior Research Fellow in Strategic Communications at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, Kelsey Bjornsgaard, Head of Practice for the Strong Cities Network, and Peter Neumann, Founding Director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation. A very warm welcome to you all. So we begin by taking a look at the impact that the conflict in Gaza is having on communities across the EU. Violent extremists from all sides are propagating polarizing narratives designed to divide communities and encourage people to choose a side. Hate speech has escalated exponentially on both sides of the debate. Meanwhile, the conflict is giving new reason to radicalized individuals to carry out acts of violence or terrorism. The terrorist attack in Paris on the 3rd of December is evidence of this.
And we have some news coming in from Paris. One person has been killed.
Now, this was a knife and hammer attack in central Paris.
An attack police say may have been fueled in part by anger over the war in Gaza.
The attacker said he could not bear the situation in Gaza and that he could not stand Muslims being killed in Afghanistan and Palestine.
So let me turn now to the panel to help us untangle some of the ways in which this conflict is being exploited by violent extremists and the impact this is having. Peter, if I can turn to you first. We heard in the clip that the perpetrator of these Paris attacks said he was upset because so many Muslims are dying in Afghanistan and Palestine. Do you think this Paris attack is a portent of a possible new wave of terrorism across Europe?
In fact, there was another attack in France before. We've seen attacks in Belgium, attempted attacks in Germany. I do think that the events of 7th of October have really mobilized a lot of Islamists, which before had been, not dormant, but had not necessarily known what is up next.
And are you seeing similar trends?
Yeah, I think what I would want to stress out is how much we've seen of a conducive environment where we're increasingly seeing polarization. And this is being exploited in the context of the conflict, but also how governments may be responding to the conflict and how that's fueling into that polarization and ultimately into violent extremism.
Yeah, we've seen that cities are facing a serious challenge in the wake of this crisis. Also just looking at, the challenges that are presented by the mass protests and demonstrations. There's been thousands globally since the conflict began. If you take Germany for an example, there was 170 just in the 20 days immediately following the conflict. And from that, there's serious logistical and security challenges of managing gatherings of thousands or tens of thousands of people. There's the potential for violence. So, in Germany, for example, more than a dozen of those protests did result in violence. You have issues with counter-protests. So in London, there was a surge of far-right activities, I guess you could say, running in parallel, disguised as kind of counter-protests, which thankfully didn't result in violence, but still occupy a huge amount of police resourcing. There's a huge amount of support that is required for the affected communities. As you said, rises in anti-Semitism, but also in Islamophobia. These cities need to be able to provide additional support and services to the affected communities. And of course, there's the risks that we see of long-term impacts to social cohesion. So we don't want to see, the conflict that's happening in Gaza being played out in, our cities across Europe as these divides between communities become deeper and potentially more hostile.
Yeah, and these polarized narratives, they seem to be at the core of it, right? There are two very clear camps propagating on both sides. Can you maybe speak to those narratives? What are they actually saying?
Well, I can only speak from a strategic communications perspective. I think for me, the problem that I'm seeing is that people are now being pushed to choose a side. You're either with us or against us, which means there's not enough space now to have a more inclusive narrative. So I've mentioned governments before across Europe, and I really think it's important that any strategic communications emanating from governments should really take into consideration in creating this space for inclusivity and not feed into that polarization. That also means that perhaps when they communicate around the conflict, to have a better understanding around the importance of communicating the nuances of their conflict to the public, so that we don't actually feed into that polarization, and they can have this more inclusive space where people can actually come and perhaps express some of those issues. So that would be one of the concerns around that polarization and the link with policy.
There's a really interesting example from Utrecht, actually, in the Netherlands, where on the day after the conflict began, the mayor immediately met with faith leaders, both from the Jewish community and the Muslim community. They came together to then make a joint statement and sort of set what the city's response was going to be from the beginning, and making sure that it's working directly with communities to be able to provide that support, but also try to head off some of this polarization right from the outset. And it really comes down to a matter of framing rather than, but, it's a framing of and. These things have happened, and these other things are also happening. So being able to recognize two truths at the same time that correspond rather than contrasting them against each other, which feeds into these polarizing narratives. And what we saw out of Utrecht, I think, is a really good example of what local governments can do in the immediate response to such polarizing conflicts, to be able to try to insulate their own communities from experiencing and then replicating that.
It's important to do this partly also because it's such a central conflict that's giving rise to all of this. I remember 10 years ago, we were looking at Syria, and people were going and joining ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And many of them were hesitating because they didn't understand the conflict. This was a conflict in the Middle East. It was Muslims against Muslims. Who was really fighting whom? It was kind of complicated. This conflict now is actually very simple and very central. It's about the Holy Land. It's about Jerusalem. It's Muslims against Jews. It's us against them. It's both sides accusing each other of genocide. If you think your people are being killed, exterminated, what is the only legitimate response to that? It is, of course, also to counter that by aggression. And so that makes it so difficult because it's such a central conflict. It's so black and white to begin with. I wonder how easy it is to break through with strategic communications in a situation that is so hardcore.
Peter, you were mentioning, the different waves of Daesh. For instance, I remember in the early terrorist attacks we had in the UK, a lot of it was driven also in Australia by foreign policy, where we looked at Daesh. We also talked, some of the people who left because there was some compassion, empathy, really wanting to try to go and help. So you have some similar dynamics, and I really think there's a lot of things we can learn from those previous incidents and how we have communicated, and how we can actually do better and not feed into that polarization, into that divide. So taking into consideration that emotional, collective, and how do we communicate around that.
So maybe to take a step back, these emotions, these polarizing narratives, who seem to be very black and white, right? They are being used to capitalize on the frustrations people are having, the anger people are having, and driving people to more radical pathways. Have you seen examples of that in your work? And how do they get these people? How do they recruit these people into these violent actions?
Well, it's really always the same. It's about the notion of an existential threat. We saw that in Syria 10 years ago. People were being told, your people you share an identity with, people you identify with are being killed, raped, exterminated, babies are being killed, and you have to do something about it. Otherwise, your people are going to be extinguished. And this sense and notion of existential threat, that's what we're seeing right now as well. And of course, that is amplified by plenty of social media, visual imagery of dead babies, of bombardments, which are having a profound emotional effect on people and which are prompting people to say, I have to do something, I have to defend my people. And that's really the important thing. People who are engaged in these acts rarely see themselves as the aggressor. They do see themselves as people defending their people, their identity.
Not surprisingly, this conflict is also being fiercely fought online. Digital technologies are being weaponized by actors on all sides to reach and engage audiences online. Much of the online content is on video and image-based platforms, making it difficult to detect and moderate. And much of the language of hate and harassment uses niche terms and acronyms, making auto-detection difficult. Earlier, I spoke with James Han, Managing Director of Digitalis and Head of Digital Risks, and asked him how, in the context of the conflict in Gaza, digital technologies are being used to create and spread extremist content online, and how concerned we should be about the nature and volume of this content.
Conflict has historically been a driving force behind technological innovation. In the context of today's chaotic digital landscape, conflicts like those in Gaza, Israel, or Russia's war in Ukraine have provided fertile ground for rapid technological developments due to the volumes of content creation and consumption. Unfortunately, during this period of rapid technological developments and intense platform misuse, global technology companies have reported dramatic cutbacks in staff numbers and content and safety moderation teams, posing one of the biggest challenges in the fight against mis- and disinformation.
So let me turn to you first, Virginie, picking up on the comments made by James. How are extremists using digital technologies such as AI, but also platforms such as TikTok to their advantage?
What I have seen in the context of my work, specifically in relation to disinformation and violent extremism, it's the large amount of disinformation that is being produced using new types of technology. And as was mentioned before, it becomes very difficult to tell what is true and what is real from what is not real. But at the end of the day, I suppose it doesn't really matter if you're actually consuming the type of disinformation, whether it's true or it's not true, as a consumer. So of course that poses a lot of challenges for practitioners, but also for policymakers, around how could we actually respond to that type of disinformation beyond just taking them down. I also think there's really, from a practitioner point of view, because one of the research that we're currently conducting at ICCT, we travel to different places in the Western Balkans, but also in the South Caucasus, for instance. And the understanding between the nexus of disinformation, specifically on one hand, and violent extremism on the other, and the two together, is something that practitioners, but even law enforcement, for example, practitioners are still struggling to understand. So you could imagine that having just the relationship between the two, and in addition to that, understanding how AI, for example, feeds into the violent extremist disinformation and how it's being used by those groups poses new challenges if you already have some difficulties in this understanding the nexus between the two.
Do you share that feeling that there's a gap between the use of online technology by extremists and what practitioners do?
Oh, absolutely. I think Virginie's really raised what we've seen as being one of the biggest issues, is just a lack of capacity. So if you're looking at, sort of local government and policymakers, understanding what that nexus is, but also understanding the technologies and knowing how to respond to them. When you have sort of, when you think about, kind of local politicians, but also, like civil servants, for example, they often don't have the technological expertise that's needed, especially considering how quickly the technologies change. So the people who are responsible for making those local policies, but also actioning them, don't have the capacities to do so. If you're looking at sort of CSOs or, community actors, same things, there's big gaps in, the kind of fundamental understandings that Virginie mentioned, but also the technological understandings. And then the public more widely. There's a serious need for digital education, civic education, and an intersection between those two to make sure that everybody at every level of society is able to understand and respond to the challenge effectively. Because if we're not taking a whole of society approach to this in bridging those gaps, it's going to fall down at some point.
I think it's also just the volume of stuff right now. It's a tsunami of stuff that comes out, and it's very hard to see how you can counter that with a couple of videos here and there. They may be well-intentioned, but they are not. They're a drop in the ocean compared to what's coming out. There's also an age gap. You mentioned TikTok. I wonder how many people my age are on TikTok or even understand how it works. This is something new that didn't exist 10 years ago when we had the mobilization in relation to the Syrian conflict. This is something that a lot of people involved in policymaking need to still get familiar with.
Yeah, and these narratives and the words they use also seem to be changing constantly, right? It's a very dynamic landscape. So how do we stay on top of that as practitioners?
I think it's really hard. I think it's about ultimately it's about education. Just to give you an example, we're always talking about this as if these are kind of weird young people who are vulnerable to radicalization being affected by this. I have personally nephews, nieces, people who are friends of my relatives, who are at no risk of radicalization, educating themselves about the Middle Eastern conflict over the past couple of months through social media with predictable results. And they are writing to me, why is Israel killing babies? So they are getting their information. They are a blank canvas, and that blank canvas is now being filled with social media information. And we haven't even begun to be able to counter that.
I think we also need to move beyond this idea that it's only young people that are at risk. If you look at people who are most vulnerable to disinformation, it's often those who are over the age of 50. And those are also the people who are more likely to go out and vote. So we see, serious consequences of disinformation from older populations. A lot of the resourcing and training and focus of, policy and action is focused on youth with good reason. But we also need to keep in mind, the older generations as well.
If I may add to what you're saying, I think what is important also to remember is that we're increasingly seeing this mainstreaming of extremism. So how we have more and more, I'm not going to say radical societies, but this mainstream of extremism, which means that disinformation flows two ways. We tend to think that you mentioned a lot extremists and violent extremists, but yes, violent extremists produce disinformation, and then it travels into different echo chambers, and then eventually will find its way into mainstream society. But what we're also seeing is the other way around, is that you might have disinformation coming from mainstream society, then being, maybe broadcasted by the media intentionally or unintentionally. I won't comment on that. And then it will eventually find its way to violent extremist milieu. So I think it's really important to understand the spectrum of that and the dynamics. And then how is it that we protect our society and safeguard our societies against this? Because, when we talk about new technologies, we talk about the online space, we talk about the intergenerational gap, all of that is very important. But I would also stress that, online work is important, but the offline work for practitioners remains equally important. And I would say the work around prevention nowadays is even more important than it was before.
Absolutely, yeah. And we also...
A lot of the content that we're concerned about is not explicitly extremist content. So you'll have a lot of content that supports extremist worldviews and is important to, the extremist narrative that is not in of itself clear-cut. It's not illegal content.
Lawful but awful.
Yes, you have a lot of content that's lawful but awful, that is, hateful, but not necessarily violates the rules of the laws of hate speech.
And to wrap up this segment, I'm curious, have you noticed any foreign information manipulation or interference in relation to the conflict in Gaza?
It's still too fresh. We need to do a bit more research around that. But to find out if there were actual FEMI or an increase in FEMI in relation to the conflict, I think we'd have to look a little bit more carefully around the mapping of the disinformation, how it's traveling, what kind of media outlets might be picking it up. And you see that, in some cases we've seen it in Ukraine, but we've seen it also in disinformation in other contexts like the South Caucasus, also the Western Balkans, that you do have a Russian influence, for instance. But you wouldn't be able to see this unless you actually do that mapping work of disinformation.
So as ever, the violent extremist threat continues to evolve. Clearly, the impact of global events, the exploitation of digital technologies, and the rise of foreign information manipulation and interference are just some of the issues we have to keep our eyes on as we head into the new year. But what other threats should we be concerned about?
So I think this situation resulting from Gaza will keep us busy for probably a long time. And I think it will be jihadist attacks on the one hand, but also, of course, there is a risk of cumulative extremism that we're getting a situation where society is becoming even more polarized. And perhaps we're seeing responses from the far right as well. And this is why it's so important that security agencies, but also prevention practitioners work so hard to prevent terrorist attacks, because you don't want to set off that spiral that can then lead to whole societies becoming really polarized and extreme.
Polarization, I think, is really the thing that we're most concerned about in the different forms that that's taking. The kind of mainstreaming of extremism and extremist ideas and the impact that that's having on the social fabric of cities. Because what we're seeing is that most of the cities across Europe are not necessarily equipped to face the challenges that are emerging in their cities. So, you have larger capital cities that are really well financed, but to the neglect of, some of the smaller cities. And as we've seen through the mainstreaming of extremism and the rise of more sort of far right, political parties, a lot of this is happening in rural centers. And a lot of these smaller cities just don't have the capacity, they don't have the budgets, they don't have the resourcing or the experience to deal with it. So one of the things we're most concerned with is how these, small to medium-sized cities are going to cope, and how, countries, across Europe are going to be able to take a more unified and coordinated whole of society approach that's really going to be necessary.
So I guess to reply to what Peter was saying about this cumulative effect, and I think you've also touched upon a little bit of this, is how much the amplification of disinformation is becoming really problematic. But I think one of the main challenges for me around disinformation and the mainstreaming of extremism is also around the notion of trust. We've seen in the last few years the decline of public trust, so trust towards the governments and institutions. Trust is really also very much about social cohesion. So the more cohesive your society is, the more trust there can be. So it's not just about generating trust in times of crisis, but it's also how do you generate trust on a daily basis. So how much trust you actually have in the bank, for local cities, national governments. If you have enough in the bank, and then you can generate even more during times of crisis, then you can face strengthen your social cohesion, but also face the challenges, for example, of disinformation, produced by violent extremists or by hostile actors, which are really coming to undermine our social fabric. So that would be one of the challenges, is how do we generate sufficient public trust so that we collectively can come together and really face the challenges of disinformation and FIMI.
Yeah, and it's exactly right. It's being able to shift our focus more to preparedness and prevention rather than a sole focus on response.
And we didn't even touch upon the still ongoing war in Ukraine. Do you think that will have an impact in 2024?
Well, it depends on how the war goes, right? So a lot can happen in the theater of conflict, and that may have some consequences in Europe too. So I would say it depends very much on what happens, and I think it's very important not to lose sight of that. I think there's a tendency always to chase after the latest thing, but the nature of prevention is precisely to keep an interest in topics even when they are not necessarily in the news every day.
And the other part of that is being mindful of fatigue, that when people are sort of overwhelmed with ongoing conflicts in different places and, kind of ongoing global crises and bad news, how do you keep people engaged while still managing fatigue?
I'm sure these topics are all on the radar of many practitioners in the network. Do you have any trends or themes we should also focus on for the next year?
Perhaps a final trend that I would like to highlight, and I think it has to be on our radar for the years to come, is obviously climate change and the relationship between climate change and migration flow. So what does it mean within PCV for practitioners, but also for policymakers? We have seen for quite some time now that climate events are being instrumentalized and exploited by different violent extremist groups. So you may have groups, who will pretend that they deliver humanitarian aid because we don't have access to those populations, and it is linked to the way they instrumentalize the climate narrative. So I think that is something that needs to be in our radar in the next few years.
Yeah, what makes me slightly optimistic, despite all the doom and gloom, is that, of course, in contrast to maybe 10 years ago, we are actually, in terms of prevention and security agencies, countering terrorism, we're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of expertise, a lot of manpower that has built up over the past 10 years. A lot of the people that are now working on prevention or with police intelligence services have been working on these issues for a long time. And so in that sense, I think we're better equipped than 10 years ago in terms of countering potential threats.
We're also seeing much greater cooperation on this point between sort of national and local actors as well, but also different local actors sort of across the EU. So there's also more opportunities for exchange, for collaboration, for cooperation. So I think we are in a much better place to begin addressing these challenges.
And perhaps coming back to this notion of new technologies, I actually see a lot of opportunities to work with new technologies. We tend to have this idea that technologies are a risk or a threat. It is true. There are risks and threats related to the use of new technologies that can be exploited by hostile actors and violent extremists. But at the same time, could we look at new technologies and how they can help us as practitioners, as policymakers, to do better work? So thinking about AI and how AI could be used to do intervention work, for example, especially when we look at the mass of information or disinformation that is out there in the online space, where we can't be everywhere, but perhaps the new technologies can help us do some of that work.
Thank you. I'm pleased that we ended on a happy note for this episode of The View. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I want to thank our guests for the contributions and insights, and I want to thank you all for watching. If you would like to discover more about some of the topics addressed in this program, please go to the RAND Practitioners website, where you can access papers, information about upcoming events, and much more. Until the next episode of The View, I wish you all a peaceful year ahead. Goodbye for now.